Well, to discuss more on the Israel-Iran conflict, now let's cut across to Melbourne, where Professor Tilman Ruff is now joining us live. He is the co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and a Nobel Peace Laureate. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let me begin by asking you, sir, how do you assess Israel's attack on nuclear infrastructure sites, and what do the Israeli strikes mean for Iran's nuclear program?
Well, the strikes have certainly been very extensive and, by all reports, multiple sites involved and significant damage to both the nuclear facilities themselves, but also the energy and power infrastructure that those facilities crucially need. It's a very dangerous situation, of course, that risks the escalation that we're seeing with broader attacks on civilian targets, on energy infrastructure, that risks drawing in many players in the Middle East and potentially more nuclear-armed powers. Of course, it's supremely ironical that Israel has claimed the right for a preemptive attack here, as they described it, although there was no sign that an attack on Israel from Iran was imminent. But it is the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East. So this is, unfortunately, one would have to say, really the law of the jungle. This is not the way that nuclear affairs and non-proliferation should be managed. It's a really alarming situation.
Now, the attacks by Israel killed key Iranian nuclear scientists, of course, military leaders, and representatives of overseeing the U.S. nuclear talks. With the sixth round of nuclear talks now halted, do you think after this escalation, Iran would be willing to come to the table? Now, we've just heard that Israeli media has claimed that they have sought Qatar and Oman to get Washington and Tehran to speak to each other on these negotiations.
Well, it would almost appear that these attacks were designed to derail the discussions between the US and Iran that had been continuing with some hopeful signs. And of course, diplomacy is always better than conflict and escalation. So I think it's perfectly understandable that in this context of ongoing and escalating attacks, Iran has said it will not continue these negotiations. And it would be hard actually to design a strategy that may be more effective at accelerating Iranian determination to develop nuclear weapons than this kind of attack, which really not just the nuclear facilities and the programs themselves, as of course many civilian targets, but also the diplomacy that we need to resolve these nuclear disputes peacefully is also a casualty of this conflict.
Right, and that being said, U.S. said that it will not let Iran have nuclear weapons. Now, the Israeli attack hit one of the key sites in the Iranian nuclear program, Natanz, which is Iranian enrichment plant. Do you think Israel was successful in fulfilling, in part, what U.S. wanted? And can this force Iran to come to the table?
I think it could go both ways. It's more likely, I would assess, that this might increase the hand of those in Iran who would argue for a nuclear weapons capability. And it's supremely tragic that this is happening now because of the abandonment by the United States, the previous Trump administration in 2018, of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement between multiple nations and Iran that curtailed very effectively Iran's nuclear program. Under that previous agreement, Iranian enrichment of fuel was only to reactor grade, not to anywhere close to weapons grade, in extremely limited quantities, with the most intrusive and rigorous inspection and continuous monitoring regime that any country has ever accepted on its nuclear program, with constant 24 hours a day, 365 days a year presence of international inspectors. And the International Atomic Energy Agency reported every 3 months for 3 years that Iran was in compliance with its obligations. It was the abandonment of that agreement which was the trigger for Iran to increase its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and therefore the closeness to developing, to having the fuel to build multiple nuclear weapons. This is an entirely foreseeable consequence of the inconsistency of great powers like the United States. And of course, while any states have nuclear weapons, given that the means to acquire nuclear weapons are now widely available to any determined state, it's the possession of nuclear weapons by some states and their continued insistence on their right uniquely to wield these weapons without any serious program to disarmament that is at the root cause of this problem of latent proliferation that has now emerged more strongly in Iran.
And that being said, do you think Iran would want to go back to its nuclear ambitions, and how dangerous could that be, according to you?
Well, it's pretty clear from the recent International Atomic Energy Agency assessments that Iran did have an early nuclear weapons program at least until 2003, and it has yet to fully cooperate with the agency in really coming clean about what exactly was done where and what has happened to all of those materials. But that's 20 years in the past. All of the assessments currently from the IAEA as well as from intelligence communities around the world, notably in the United States, are that Iran does not have, at least until now, an active nuclear weapons program. And what the abandonment of the previous Iran deal did was shift the timeline so that if Iran did want to acquire nuclear weapons under the previous deal, that would have taken at least a year. It would have been obvious. Whereas now, Iran probably has over 100 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, enough for several nuclear weapons, and it likely could produce those, including in facilities that are very difficult to destroy, particularly at Fordo, which is very deeply buried underground. It could likely develop nuclear weapons, produce them within a matter of weeks or months now. So it's really unfortunate that these events may be driving Iran in exactly the wrong direction.
Right, and I'll come to Fordo because you picked it up, but before that, let's talk about the targets that Israel has hit, like in Natanz, and that according to reports, it led to no contamination. But according to you, is that the case? What is your analysis of that being said? Can Israel risk such contamination and further attack more nuclear sites, which are underground, as you mentioned, Fordo?
Well, yes, that's a concern, and the International Atomic Energy Agency Director Grossi, in his report to the Security Council on Friday, highlighted that any attacks on nuclear facilities risk releasing radiation indiscriminately into the environment and causing persistent contamination and harm much beyond the site and potentially beyond the country attacked. So far, the public evidence would suggest that radiological and chemical contamination, which must occur if you attack such a facility militarily, is confined to the site, and that enhanced levels of radiation haven't yet been observed beyond the site. But Iran has also announced that it has suspended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency while it's under attack. So it will be with these escalating attacks that certainly the risk of significant chemical and radiological contamination, which could have implications for the whole region, not just for Iran, is still a very real risk.
Oh, absolutely. So before we go any further, I do want you to stay with me, but there's some breaking news. I would like to go to that. Breaking news just coming in as Iran and Israel continue to strike each other. Missiles were seen above the Jordanian city of Irbid. And this comes after Iran announced a fresh salvo of missiles aimed at Israel. This is just news coming in that we are getting, where there has been attack in the Jordanian city of Idlib. Now, this, of course, probably would be another front in this war. It's to see, but these are the latest breaking news that we are receiving, and these visuals that we can see in Idlib. Now, the missiles were seen above Jordanian city of Idlib, and this comes after Iran announced a fresh salvo of missiles aimed at Israel. Of course, some information does need to come exactly where. So Iran has fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at Israel. Now, where has this particular missile come from? We're just going to try and find out more information. So far, what we know is that these missiles were seen above the Jordanian city of Idlib. Right, and this is, of course, coming after Iran had announced a fresh salvo of missiles aimed at Israel, which led to a number of deaths as well. As of now, the current count of casualties in Israel has been 8 in Israel. Now, this is the latest that we're getting in. And on that, I would like to go back to our guest. This is the latest development we're getting. How do you assess this whole escalation that's happening? Now we know the Jordanian city of Idlib has, we see some missiles over the Jordanian city. Jordan had clearly, of course, they had closed their airspace. What do you make of this?
Yes, well, we don't know where these missiles came from or where they were headed. Of course, missiles are not foolproof, and they can be fired inadvertently or miss their targets. It's also the case that Israel is said to have targeted with missiles a Houthi important leadership in Yemen, and that Yemen has also fired missiles against Israel. So this really highlights the risk of involvement of wider countries beyond just Israel and Iran at present.
Right, exactly. Now, Professor, I would like to also go back to our, about nuclear risks. So, according to you, what does this whole escalation mean for wider nuclear risks, such as, the proliferation and the international nuclear regime?
It's really hard to know at this point, but it's hard to see that this escalation could strengthen that regime. It's really a fundamental challenge to the rule of law. The 9 nuclear-armed states are under binding legal obligations, treaty and customary international law, to disarm their nuclear arsenals. They haven't done so. Now, more than 50 years after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty enshrined that obligation in law, more than 40 nations, any nation that possesses nuclear reactors or enrichment facilities, has the capacity to produce the materials to develop nuclear weapons. So the urgent overriding global need here to make progress is that all nations in the world move seriously towards nuclear disarmament, which would remove the incentive for other nations to join that club that threaten all of us, whether we consent to or not, whether we're in those nations or not. We would be affected by a nuclear conflict. The need to progress nuclear disarmament and finally eliminate these doomsday weapons is the absolute underwriting need. But one of the things that undermines that is the duplicity and the inconsistency that, as I mentioned at the start, that Israel, the only nuclear-armed state in the Middle East, claims a right to wage war on another country to avoid its development of nuclear weapons, which it itself was the first to introduce into the Middle East decades ago. That kind of double standard is simply unsustainable. As long as some nations have nuclear weapons, others will want to acquire them. And if it's not Iran this time, it may be Iran in the future or other nations in the future, until we finally manage to make global progress towards nuclear disarmament, and the rule of law replaces the law of the jungle, which is essentially what we're seeing now. This is the worst possible way for the world to manage the proliferation dangers of nuclear technology with indiscriminate unilateral military actions.
Right. And how important do you think diplomatic talks come in getting Tehran and Washington to come to the table for the talks? We know that Vladimir Putin, Russian president, had a phone call with Trump where these Israel and Iran conflict dominated those talks, and where, of course, they came to the point that this should actually de-escalate. How important do you think would diplomatic relations or diplomatic talks help in getting this to de-escalate and get Iran and U.S. on the table to talk on a nuclear agenda?
Well, of course, all nations should be urging restraint and seeking to develop and support whatever diplomatic initiatives can both end this immediate war and then progress resolution of the wider issues around Iran's nuclear program. I mentioned that the Israeli attack almost seems deliberately timed and targeted to derail the negotiations that were ongoing between the United States and Iran, and indeed one of the military and political leaders who's been assassinated in these attacks was the leader of the negotiating delegation on the Iranian side to the talks with the US. So that must be a setback to the negotiations that were underway, and it's very difficult to negotiate without some kind of, while this conflict is escalating. I think Israel is only able to maintain this level of military aggression and capacity because of the support and supplies and funding provided by other nations, particularly the United States. And India here, I might mention too, should have significant influence with Israel, given its past extensive cooperation on military equipment and technology. But all responsible countries around the world should be urging an end to these hostilities, to this escalating war, and to return to negotiations as soon as possible, whether it's the negotiations that were underway before or in a different form.
Right. And also I would like to, in the end, just take your opinion on the simple question is, why is Iran having this nuclear weapons dangerous? If you could just explain us over that.
Well, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It has clearly flirted in the past with early research and development that was headed for nuclear weapons development, but that program did not progress and was very effectively curtailed by the previous agreement in force, which the Trump administration abandoned. So, Iran there was a Board of Governors resolution at the International Atomic Energy Agency just on Thursday that declared Iran was not complying with its safeguards agreement, and that the agency was no longer able to verify that Iran's nuclear program was entirely peaceful. So Iran certainly has a case to answer there, but there has also been quite consistent political leadership at the highest level from the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who has repeatedly spoken of the Islamic fatwa against nuclear weapons, against the prohibition in Islamic morality and law against such heinous weapons of mass destruction. So the situation in Iran is clearly not clear or one-sided, but it's clear that they do not now have nuclear weapons, and they, as far as we know, do not have a nuclear weapons program. The problem is that if you can enrich uranium, then you can enrich uranium either to run nuclear reactors, or you can to build material for weapons. And unfortunately, the capacity to do those things is inseparable. So there is an inherent proliferation potential in all nuclear activities involving reactors and enrichment. And that's the problem that we're having to deal with. It would be much better if those could be restricted and internationalized so that the means to build nuclear weapons are not available to any determined nation as they currently are.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Professor Tilman Ruffer, and giving your insights. Of course, it's still to see how the talks go, or if the conflict does come to an escalation or goes forward. But thank you so much for joining on the show and giving your insights.
Thank you.